They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. The morning sun spilled across Willow Ridge Academy like a golden lie, warming marble steps, where laughter echoed and expensive shoes clicked in confident rhythm. Alyssa Carter stepped off the battered yellow bus, her sneakers thin and silent against the polished sidewalk. No one turned. No one noticed. Alyssa adjusted her frayed backpack straps, her eyes fixed on the ground, each step rehearsed to disappear. Around her, students draped in designer jackets talked loudly, tossing perfect hair, sharing jokes that stung like unseen needles. They were born into applause. She was born into echoes. Madison Harrington's laugh cut through the courtyard, sharp as shattered glass. Alyssa didn't have to look up. She could feel the weight of Madison's gaze, the kind that didn't just see you but stripped you down piece by piece. "There she is," Madison called out, her voice dripping with honeyed poison. "Our little charity case." "Did you borrow those shoes from the donation bin again?" A few girls giggled, their eyes gleaming. Alyssa's fingers curled tighter around the strap, her knuckles pale. Her mother's voice flickered in her mind. "Keep your head high, baby. Even if they never see you, you must see yourself." But today, even that voice felt distant. A fragile thread she barely clung to. Inside, the halls swallowed her whole. Lockers slammed. Conversations buzzed. Posters of upcoming recitals and charity galas lined the walls, worlds she wasn't invited into. She moved quietly to her seat in the music classroom, praying to become air, to vanish before the next wave of scorn arrived. "Mr." Grayson entered, carrying the air of someone who believed the world owed him obedience. His eyes scanned the room, resting on her like a cold fingertip on skin. "We'll be performing today," he announced, his voice flat but edged with something almost gleeful. "A spontaneous piano piece. I want to see true emotion, not empty practice." Alyssa's heart stuttered. She felt it echo up to her throat, a sharp knock begging to escape. Madison's smirk widened, her fingers drumming on her desk. "Oh, Alyssa," she purred. "Are you even capable of feeling anything worth hearing?" Laughter bloomed around her like toxic flowers. Alyssa swallowed, her lips dry. She could hide. She could shrink back into her small, safe corner, or she could rise. But as the noise swallowed her, the choice felt like a distant star, flickering on the edge of her courage. And all she could hear was the sound of her own silent melody, waiting for a moment to finally be played. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa Carter sat by the window of the old yellow school bus, her fingers tracing invisible lines against the fogged glass. Outside, the morning sky shifted from soft gray to pale gold, promising a warmth she wouldn't feel. The bus jolted over a pothole, making her backpack slide from her lap to the floor. She bent down quickly, clutching the worn fabric as if it held the last piece of her. When the bus finally pulled up to Willow Ridge Academy, she hesitated before stepping off. Students spilled out of luxury cars, hugging friends, waving designer coffee cups, greeting each other with loud laughter that sliced the air like cold wind. Alyssa's sneakers met the pristine walkway with a silent surrender. She kept her head low, avoiding the eyes that scanned her like she was a mistake someone had left behind. The courtyard gleamed under the sun, marble tiles polished to perfection. A group of girls gathered near the fountain, their laughter rising in sweet, cruel waves. Madison Harrington stood at the center, her blonde hair catching the light like a halo, her blue eyes sharp enough to cut through bone. Alyssa heard her before she saw her. "Well, look who finally arrived," Madison called, flipping her hair with practiced grace. "Alyssa Carter, our resident ghost." Someone snickered. Another girl pretended to fan her nose. "Did you walk here, or did the charity bus run late again?" Alyssa clenched her jaw, her fingers trembling at her sides. She kept walking, one foot, then the other. Her heartbeat drowned out the world, each thud screaming at her to run. Inside, the hallways buzzed with life she wasn't part of. Lockers banged open and shut. Posters for spring recitals and scholarship auditions fluttered like promises she would never be allowed to touch. Alyssa slipped into the music room early, sinking into a chair at the far back. The piano sat at the front like a silent king, its black lacquer gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She felt its call deep in her bones, an ache she carried for years. When she was little, she used to sneak into the local church to play. Her fingers learned to dream before she could spell her own name. She played for no one but the cracked walls and the faint echo of her own heart. At Willow Ridge, that dream felt like a fragile bubble pressed under a boot. Mr. Grayson entered, his footsteps crisp, his gaze sweeping across the room like a cold wind. He tapped the music sheets against his palm, pausing when he saw Alyssa. He didn't smile. He never did. Students poured in behind him, the room filling with chatter and perfume and the scent of polished shoes. Madison and her entourage strutted to the front row, laughing as if the world was a stage set just for them. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. The room snapped to silence. "Today," he announced, "you will perform an impromptu piano piece. No sheet music, no rehearsed scores. I want to hear you, the real you." Alyssa felt her stomach drop, a cold wave crashing over her spine. Madison leaned back in her chair, a smirk dancing on her lips. "Oh, this will be good," she whispered to her friend, loud enough for Alyssa to hear. Alyssa swallowed. Her palms turned slick. She thought of her mother's tired face, the nights she worked extra shifts just to keep food on the table. The evenings Alyssa sat alone at the church piano, playing until her fingers ached and her heart felt a little less heavy. She didn't have perfect nails or diamond earrings. She didn't have a private tutor whispering secrets of Mozart into her ear. All she had was the music that lived inside her, raw, trembling, real. Alyssa closed her eyes for a moment. In that darkness, she heard it, the quiet melody that had always been hers alone. When she opened her eyes again, the noise of the room returned like a violent tide. But deep inside, something had shifted. She wasn't ready to stand, not yet, but a small spark had ignited. A silent promise echoing between her ribs. They would hear her. Someday. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa sat frozen at her desk, each word from Mr. Grayson sinking into her skin like icy rain. An impromptu piano performance. No preparation. No place to hide. The class erupted into whispers and giggles. Madison's laughter rose above them all, bright and cutting, like a blade sharpened just for her. "Oh, Alyssa, are you going to play us one of your charity church songs?" Madison teased, twisting a lock of her golden hair around her finger. Her friends snickered, echoing her scorn like obedient shadows. Alyssa's fingers twitched against the desk, nails digging into the wood. The memory of the church piano flickered behind her eyelids, the chipped keys, the hollow echo in the empty hall. That was her sanctuary, her small hidden world. Here it felt like a cage. Mr. Grayson paced at the front, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. "I don't want mechanical recitals," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "I want vulnerability. I want real emotion." Madison raised her hand dramatically, her smile stretching wider. "Mr. Grayson, I'm sure Alyssa has plenty of raw emotion. Maybe she can show us what real poverty sounds like." Laughter exploded. Alyssa felt her breath catch in her throat, her vision blurring for a second. Her pulse slammed against her ribs, screaming for escape. She thought of her mother again, Monica Carter, who worked double shifts at the hospital, who came home every night with tired eyes and soft hands that still found time to hold her. Alyssa pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling the trembling underneath. When the bell rang for lunch, she moved like a ghost through the crowded halls. Conversations wrapped around her in waves she couldn't touch. Posters for upcoming charity concerts hung from the walls, each one another reminder of stages she'd never be invited to stand on. At her locker, she turned the dial slowly, praying for invisibility. But Madison's voice found her, as always. "Oh, Alyssa," Madison called, sauntering closer. "You should probably just fake being sick tomorrow. It'd be less embarrassing than showing them how tragic you really are." Her entourage burst into cruel laughter. One girl mimicked playing a piano with exaggerated, sloppy movements. Another pretended to sob, wiping fake tears from her eyes. Alyssa's hand slipped, her book spilling to the ground with a sharp clap. Pages scattered, sliding across the polished floor. Madison's heels clicked closer, stopping just inches from Alyssa's fingers. "Oops," Madison cooed, looking down with mock concern. "Need help? Oh, wait. No one's coming to save you." Alyssa stayed on her knees, gathering the papers slowly, her eyes burning. Her mother's words returned, fragile but steady. "You have to stand for yourself, Alyssa, even when it feels impossible." She stood, her shoulders shaking but her spine straighter than it had felt in years. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. For the first time, Madison's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of something Alyssa almost mistook for doubt. Alyssa turned away, her steps careful and measured. The hall seemed impossibly long, every laugh echoing behind her like ghosts she couldn't outrun. But inside, something stirred. A small, bright ember, fighting against the dark. By the time she reached the music room again, the noise outside felt far away, like waves crashing on some distant shore. She walked past the piano, her fingers brushing lightly against its surface. It felt like a heartbeat, waiting. Tomorrow was coming. And for the first time, Alyssa wasn't sure she wanted to run. She didn't know if she could win. But she knew she was done hiding. They never heard her voice. Tomorrow they would. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa sat at the edge of her bed that night, the moonlight cutting pale lines across her small room. Her fingers traced the edges of her worn-out music books, pages frayed from years of quiet practice. She pressed her palms together, closing her eyes. The silence in the room felt alive, almost deafening. Outside her window, the hum of the city drifted through, distant cars, a dog barking somewhere far away, the steady rhythm of life moving on without her. Her mother's soft voice echoed in her mind. "Your music is your truth, Alyssa. Don't let them make you forget that." She stood and crossed to the old piano in the corner. Its ivory keys were chipped, a few yellowed with age, but to her, it was more beautiful than any polished grand piano at Willow Ridge. She sat down, the bench creaking under her weight, and placed her fingers on the keys. Her breath hitched. A memory surfaced, the first time she had slipped into the church at night, the air cold and heavy, her small hands trembling as she touched the keys. Each note had felt like a fragile confession, a piece of her soul set free in an empty hall. She pressed down now, a single note ringing out, echoing in the small room. It vibrated inside her, stirring something raw and restless. She started to play slowly, a soft melody drifting up like smoke. Her eyes stayed closed, each breath syncing with the rise and fall of her hands. She wasn't playing for the academy, not for Madison, not even for Mr. Grayson. She was playing for that scared little girl who used to hide in the church, for the lonely nights when the only answer to her tears was music. She stumbled once, fingers slipping on a chord. Her chest tightened, panic flaring. But she didn't stop. She let the mistake breathe, folding it into the song like a hidden scar. In her mind, she saw Madison's smirk, the laughter in the hallway, the echo of cruel words. She pressed harder, her fingers moving faster. The melody turned sharper, a quiet rage pulsing beneath each note. She remembered her mother coming home, eyes heavy with exhaustion but still soft when they landed on her. She remembered the rejection letters for music scholarships, each one a small, careful cut. She remembered her own voice, the one she had swallowed so many times it almost disappeared. Alyssa's heart beat wildly as she reached the final chords, her breath ragged, her whole body trembling. She let the last note hang, fragile and bright, like a star trembling at the edge of the sky. When she opened her eyes, tears blurred her vision, sliding down her cheeks. She wiped them away with the back of her sleeve, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. She stood, her legs unsteady, and looked at her reflection in the dark window. The girl staring back looked small, almost breakable. But behind the tear-streaked face, there was something else, a quiet defiance, a flicker of light. She whispered into the night, her voice so soft it almost disappeared. "I won't hide anymore." The words felt heavy and new, like a promise she had waited her whole life to make. She turned from the window, her hands still shaking. Tomorrow she would walk into that room. Tomorrow she would touch those keys. She didn't know if she would fail or if they would laugh again. But tomorrow she would play, not to prove them wrong, not to please them, but because it was the only way she knew how to breathe. They never heard her voice. Tomorrow they would hear everything. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. The morning air bit at Alyssa's cheeks as she stepped off the bus, the cold sharper than usual. Her breath billowed out in small white clouds, her fingers hidden deep inside the sleeves of her old coat. Willow Ridge Academy gleamed ahead of her, all glass and marble, a monument to perfection she was never meant to touch. Students flowed through the gates, heads thrown back in laughter, shoes clicking on the polished stone. Alyssa walked through them like a shadow, her feet silent against the ground. Her mind hummed with fragments of last night's melody, each note vibrating inside her ribs like a secret heartbeat. Inside the music room, the piano waited. It glistened under the overhead lights, every curve polished to a mirror-like shine. Alyssa stopped by the doorway, her throat tightening. "Mr." Grayson stood near the piano, flipping through a stack of sheet music with mechanical precision. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. His presence alone felt like a silent command pressing down on her shoulders. Madison and her friends filed in, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Madison's eyes flicked to Alyssa, her lips curving into a slow, deliberate smirk. Well, she drawled, dropping her bag onto the front desk. "I almost thought you wouldn't show, but I guess charity cases do love to surprise." A few girls giggled, turning to exchange gleaming looks. Alyssa didn't respond. She walked to the back row, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of her chair. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing in her head like a drum. "Mr." Grayson cleared his throat. The room fell silent instantly. "We'll begin," he announced, his voice sharp and unyielding. One by one, no prepared pieces, no excuses. A few students shifted nervously, but most wore calm, practiced smiles. This was their stage, their domain. Madison rose first, sauntering to the piano with theatrical grace. She tossed her hair back, settled her fingers on the keys, and began, the room filled with confident, glittering notes. Each sound sharp and deliberate, each chord carefully planned. When she finished, the room erupted in polite applause. Madison stood, bowed slightly, and turned to glance at Alyssa with a victorious flick of her hair. A few more students played, each performance more polished than the last. Alyssa stared at her hands, her nails short and uneven, her fingers twitching like startled birds. "Then, Mr." Grayson's voice cut through the air, cold and final. "Alyssa Carter," he called. "Your turn." The words crashed over her like a wave of ice. Her legs refused to move at first, her breath trapped somewhere between her chest and her throat. Madison leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, eyes glittering. Alyssa's chair screeched softly as she stood. The room seemed to shrink, every pair of eyes pulling her deeper into their orbit. She walked to the piano, each step a battle against the gravity of fear. Her fingers brushed the glossy surface as she sat, her breath shallow and quick. She looked up once just for a moment. Madison's smirk widened. "Mr." Grayson's arms crossed, his eyes cold and waiting. Alyssa lowered her gaze to the keys. The silence pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw her mother's tired smile. She felt the warmth of the church piano under her fingertips. She heard every lonely night turned into melody, every tear woven into sound. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Then she pressed down. A single note rang out, fragile and clear, like a drop of water in an empty hall. A giggle burst from somewhere in the room, but Alyssa didn't flinch. Her fingers moved again, another note, then another, soft as a whisper, steady as a prayer. The laughter faded, replaced by a tense, brittle silence. Her fingers continued, finding each key with trembling certainty. The melody was not perfect. It wavered and dipped, but it was real. It was her. Each note carried every piece of her they never saw, the invisible girl, the daughter who waited alone, the dreamer who had only a broken piano and a stubborn heart. Her breath came faster now, her shoulders shaking with every chord. She felt the room fall away, her fear unraveling with every passing measure. When she struck the final note, it echoed into the hush like a secret finally spoken aloud. Alyssa kept her hands on the keys, her eyes closed, her heart pounding like a wild drum in her chest. She had played, not for them, not for their approval, for herself. They never heard her voice, today they did. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa's final note hovered in the air, shimmering like the last star before dawn. Her fingers trembled against the keys, her shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. Silence swallowed the room, a deep, heavy silence that felt like the world had stopped breathing. Alyssa opened her eyes slowly. In front of her, Madison sat frozen, her smirk wiped clean, her eyes wide and glassy. Her hands clutched the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Mr. Grayson's arms had dropped to his sides, his mouth slightly parted as though the words he planned to say had died on his tongue. Around them, students who had laughed, whispered, and rolled their eyes now sat still, their faces unreadable, their chests rising and falling with held breaths. Alyssa looked at her hands, the faint tremor in her fingers finally fading. She had played. She had given them everything she had tried so long to keep hidden, everything she had locked inside because the world had told her it wasn't worth hearing. A sharp inhale from the back row broke the stillness. Then another. A single clap echoed through the room, slow, uncertain. Then another joined, and another. In moments, the applause grew, rising like a wave that swept across the room, crashing against the walls, filling every corner with sound. Alyssa felt it wash over her, each clap a heartbeat, each cheer a breath she hadn't realized she was missing. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her head spinning with something she didn't have a name for yet, something like flight, something like freedom. Her gaze lifted and found Madison. The girl's face had cracked, her eyes darting side to side, searching for an anchor that wasn't there anymore. Alyssa held her gaze. For the first time, she saw no power in Madison's eyes, only disbelief. Mr. Grayson stepped forward, his shoes clicking softly against the floor. His face looked carved from stone, but beneath his rigid expression, a flicker of something shifted. Confusion, realization. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. His gaze flickered down, his shoulders stiffening as though he, too, had been forced to hear something he had never wanted to know. Alyssa turned away from him, away from Madison, away from every stare that had once pinned her in place like a specimen under glass. She stepped back from the piano, the applause still ringing, the sound vibrating in her bones. She felt light, as though gravity had loosened its grip. Every step away from the keys felt like breaking free from 1,000 invisible chains. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She just breathed. In the echoes of the room, she heard her mother's voice, soft and proud. "You've always had a voice, sweetheart. You just had to choose to let them hear it." She looked up once more, taking in every stunned face, every pair of wide eyes. Then she walked back to her seat, each footstep a quiet declaration that she no longer belonged to the shadows they had built for her. They never heard her voice. Today, they did. And they would never forget it. They never heard her voice, but today, they were about to hear her soul. The clapping faded, leaving behind an echo that clung to the walls like morning mist. Alyssa lowered herself into her seat, her heartbeat echoing so loudly in her ears it almost drowned out everything else. For a long moment, no one moved. The room felt fragile, like one sharp breath could shatter it all. Madison sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers drumming nervously against her notebook. The confidence that had once lit her eyes now flickered, dim and uncertain. Mr. Grayson finally cleared his throat, the sound brittle. He stepped forward, but his voice caught in his chest. When he spoke, it was softer than anyone had ever heard from him. "I didn't expect that," he said, each word hesitant, as though they weighed too much to carry. Alyssa didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her music had already said everything. The other students shifted in their seats, casting sideways glances at her, at Madison, at Mr. Grayson. The invisible lines of power and approval that had always dictated their world now felt blurry, broken. Mr. Grayson opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, the door creaked open. Mrs. Collins stepped inside, her presence calm yet commanding, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Alyssa. She paused, her gaze steady and warm, as if she had been waiting for this moment longer than any of them knew. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice smooth but strong, "could I speak with you for a moment?" The entire class turned, the air tightening around them. Alyssa felt her breath catch, her throat dry as sand. She stood slowly, her legs still trembling from the performance. Mrs. Collins stepped aside to let her pass. As Alyssa walked forward, Madison shifted, her foot sliding as if she wanted to stand to protest, but no words came. Mr. Grayson stepped back, his arms falling to his sides. He looked smaller somehow, as if the years of control and certainty had finally slipped from his shoulders. Alyssa crossed the threshold, stepping into the quiet hallway. The door shut behind her, sealing off the whispers that buzzed like trapped bees inside the classroom. Mrs. Collins turned to her, her eyes kind but sharp, seeing deeper than anyone had dared. "You know," she began, her voice gentle, "I've been teaching here for over 20 years. I've heard hundreds of students perform. But today I heard something different." Alyssa's lips parted, but no sound came. Mrs. Collins stepped closer, lowering her voice, as if sharing a secret meant only for them. "You have a rare gift, Alyssa, a voice that isn't just technical or learned. It's alive. It's real." Alyssa felt the words wrap around her like a blanket, warmth blooming in her chest. Her throat tightened, tears pricking at the edges of her eyes. "I've been looking for someone like you," Mrs. Collins continued, her hand hovering near Alyssa's shoulder but not touching. "Someone who plays because they must, because it's the only way they know how to exist." Alyssa swallowed, her voice barely a whisper when it finally rose. "But I'm not like them. I don't have lessons or resources." "I don't belong here." Mrs. Collins shook her head slowly, her eyes shining with certainty. "You belong more than anyone else. And if you're willing, I want to help you apply for a scholarship. A real chance to let that voice grow, to show the world what I saw today." Alyssa felt her knees weaken, her hands lifting to cover her mouth as if to keep the sob inside. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, all the nights of sacrifices, the soft reassurances whispered through tears. She dropped her hands, breathing shakily, her eyes locked on Mrs. Collins's unwavering gaze. "Why me?" she managed to ask, her voice raw. Mrs. Collins smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips. "Because you played not to impress, but to survive. That's a voice the world needs." Alyssa felt something crack open inside her, a light flooding into places she had long kept in the dark. She nodded slowly, her tears falling freely now. In that moment, under the cold hallway lights and the soft watch of Mrs. Collins, Alyssa realized she had crossed a line she could never return from. She had been invisible. She had been silent. But now she had been seen. They never heard her voice. Today they did, and someone had finally listened. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa stepped out into the fading afternoon light, her heart pounding so fiercely it seemed to echo in her ears. The hallway behind her felt distant, like a dream dissolving in the sun. She clutched her bag to her chest as she moved past students who now looked at her with something different in their eyes: curiosity, confusion, maybe even respect. But inside, a storm raged. She kept walking until she reached the front gates of Willow Ridge. The marble pillars, once symbols of everything she would never touch, now seemed smaller, less powerful. She paused, closing her eyes, trying to steady her breath. Mrs. Collins's words repeated in her mind, circling like soft threads weaving a tapestry she hadn't dared imagine. A scholarship, a chance. Alyssa felt a surge of warmth in her chest, but it was quickly followed by a flood of doubt. How could she stand beside students who had been playing since they could walk, who had private lessons, perfect instruments, teachers whispering praise into their ears? She remembered the chipped keys of the church piano, the way she had taught herself in the cold, the endless nights she played until her fingers cramped and her eyes blurred with tears. She thought of Madison's smirk, her words like poisoned arrows. "You don't belong here." Alyssa pressed her palm to her forehead, her fingers trembling. The old fear crept up her spine, wrapping around her throat like a cold hand. She turned toward the street, her feet carrying her almost on instinct. By the time she reached her apartment door, her chest ached from holding everything inside. She pushed the door open quietly. The familiar scent of warm soup and lavender soap wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. Monica Carter looked up from the kitchen counter, her face lined with exhaustion but softening instantly when she saw Alyssa. "Sweetheart," she called, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're home early today." Alyssa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat tightened, her eyes burning. Monica stepped closer, her brows furrowed in concern. "Alyssa, what happened?" Alyssa dropped her bag, the sound echoing in the small room. She ran forward, burying her face into her mother's shoulder. For a moment, there was no world beyond that small space. No piano keys, no cold eyes, no polished floors or sharp laughs, just warmth, just breath. Monica held her tightly, her hand moving gently across Alyssa's back. "Talk to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." Alyssa pulled back slowly, her tears glistening on her cheeks. I played today," she choked out, her voice raw and uneven. "I played in front of them, and they listened, Mom. They actually listened." Monica's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "And Mrs. Collins, she wants me to apply for a scholarship, a real one." Monica lifted a hand to Alyssa's face, brushing away a tear with her thumb. Her own eyes shimmered, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words. "My brave girl," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "You've always had this inside you. I knew it. I've always known." Alyssa shook her head, a sob escaping her lips. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I can't keep up? They've all had years of lessons." "I only had this old piano. I only had you." Monica cupped her daughter's face firmly now, forcing her to meet her gaze. "And that is enough," she said, her words sharp as lightning yet warm as a sunrise. "You are enough. You have always been enough." Alyssa felt the words sink deep, settling into cracks she hadn't realized were there. She inhaled shakily, the room shimmering through her tears. For the first time, the thought of the scholarship didn't feel like a far-off miracle meant for someone else. It felt real, possible. Alyssa wrapped her arms around her mother again, holding on as if to anchor herself to the ground. They stood there, two souls stitched together by every sacrifice, every whispered prayer, every quiet melody played in the dark. They never heard her voice. Tomorrow, she would make them hear it again. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa sat at the small kitchen table, the glow of her old laptop flickering softly against her face. Steam curled from a chipped mug of tea beside her, untouched and cooling fast. The scholarship application page stared back at her, each empty field a quiet dare. She traced her finger over the edge of the keyboard, her breath trembling. Her mother moved quietly in the kitchen, humming an old tune under her breath. Every few seconds, she turned to glance at Alyssa, her eyes a mixture of worry and unwavering pride. Alyssa glanced at the first question. "Why do you want to pursue music?" Her fingers hovered. Her mind spun with 1,000 images. The dark church, her fingers learning each note in secret. The echo of her own playing filling the empty pews. The nights her mother came home, exhausted but smiling just to see her at the piano. The echo of Madison's laughter, the sting of Mr. Grayson's cold eyes, the warmth of Mrs. Collins's steady voice. She closed her eyes. In the darkness, she saw her own reflection, smaller, scared, nearly invisible. But behind that image now burned a new light, fierce and unstoppable. She began to type, each word landing like a heartbeat. "I play because it is the only way I know how to speak. I play because it is the only time I feel truly alive. I do not have polished lessons or expensive instruments. I have late nights and raw fingers and a heart that refuses to stop singing, even when no one is listening." Her fingers paused. She took a shaky breath, her chest tight with something like pain and joy woven together. She continued, "Music is not just a sound to me. It is my story, my escape, my fight, and my freedom. Every note I play holds a piece of who I am, a truth I could never say out loud." She stopped again, her eyes filling. She glanced up at her mother, who stood watching her now, hands pressed over her heart, her eyes wet. Alyssa swallowed hard and returned to the screen. "I do not want this scholarship because I think I deserve more than anyone else. I want it because I have something different to offer, a voice that isn't perfect but is real. A voice that refuses to stay silent." She reread the paragraph, her chest rising and falling. When she reached the final section, "Why do you believe you belong in this program?" She hesitated. For a moment, the old doubts whispered at the edge of her mind, clawing at her resolve. Then she remembered standing before her classmates, the silence after her last note, the sudden applause, the first time they saw her as more than a ghost. She typed slowly, her words certain. I belong because I am not afraid to start from nothing. I belong because I have spent my whole life finding my voice, and I am ready to make the world listen. Her finger hovered over the submit button, her heartbeat crashing in her ears. She looked at her mother again, who nodded slowly, her eyes shining with fierce pride. Alyssa turned back to the screen, took a deep breath, and pressed submit. The confirmation message appeared. Your application has been successfully submitted. Alyssa sat back, her hands falling into her lap. A sob slipped from her lips, sharp and soft all at once. She covered her face, tears spilling through her fingers. Her mother rushed forward, wrapping her in an embrace so tight Alyssa thought she might dissolve into it. They stayed like that for a long time, the laptop screen glowing quietly beside them, marking the first step into a world Alyssa had once thought forbidden. They never heard her voice. Tomorrow, they would hear her story. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. The morning sun spilled across the city like a gentle promise. Alyssa stepped outside, the cool breeze tugging at her hair, filling her lungs with crisp air that felt brand new. She paused at the gate of her apartment building, her fingers curling lightly around the metal bars. The world beyond felt different today, brighter, softer, almost as if it was waiting for her. Her old sneakers hit the sidewalk in quiet, steady rhythms. She passed the tiny corner store where her mother sometimes bought milk after late shifts, the laundromat with the faded sign, the bus stop where she once sat hoping no one would notice her. Today, she noticed everything. She noticed the woman sweeping her porch, humming an old gospel song that floated into the morning air like a blessing. She noticed the teenage boy practicing basketball alone, his sneakers squeaking against the cracked pavement. She noticed how the light caught on the church windows down the street, how it painted the bricks in shimmering gold and rose. Alyssa stopped for a moment, closing her eyes. She let the sounds wash over her, the distant laughter of children, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of a delivery truck in the next block. For so long, she had felt like she was moving through this world behind glass, unseen and unheard. But now, each breath felt like a song. She kept walking, her steps growing faster, her heart rising in her chest like a new melody taking shape. When she reached the gates of Willow Ridge Academy, she didn't stop to look at the marble pillars or the polished floors inside. She didn't need to. Today, she wasn't walking into a battlefield. She was walking away from it. She turned and looked back once, the school shimmering in the morning light. A place that had tried to shrink her, to keep her silent. But it had also been the place where she stood up, where her hands found the keys, where her voice finally broke through the walls. She let out a slow breath, the weight in her chest unraveling like a quiet cord resolving at last. Alyssa turned back toward the city, toward home, her feet almost floating across the pavement. She began to run, her hair flying behind her, her laughter slipping out in soft bursts she couldn't hold back. Each step felt like a note, a beat, a promise. By the time she reached her building, her chest ached not from fear, but from something fierce and alive. She bounded up the stairs, two at a time, her pulse drumming a wild rhythm. At the door, she stopped, her hand resting on the knob. She closed her eyes, the echo of her own music still thrumming in her bones. They never heard her voice. Tomorrow, they would hear her everywhere. They never heard her voice, but today they were about to hear her soul. Alyssa pushed open the apartment door, her breath still ragged from running. The warmth of home wrapped around her instantly, the scent of simmering soup drifting in the air. Monica turned from the stove, her eyes lighting up the moment she saw her daughter. "Alyssa," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're back." Alyssa nodded, stepping forward, her hands still shaking. Without a word, she closed the space between them and wrapped her arms around her mother. Monica pulled her in tightly, her fingers threading through Alyssa's hair, holding her as though she might disappear if she let go. They stood there, hearts thudding in quiet sync, breaths slow and uneven. Finally, Alyssa pulled back just enough to meet her mother's gaze. Her eyes shone, but this time not with fear or doubt. "I submitted it," she whispered, her voice breaking at the edges. "The scholarship application, it's real now." Monica's eyes filled instantly, her lips trembling into a proud, tearful smile. "My brave girl," she whispered, pressing her forehead to Alyssa's. "I always knew you could do it." Alyssa felt the truth of those words settle into her chest like a final, comforting chord. She turned and crossed the small living room to the corner where her old piano waited. She sat down, the familiar creak of the bench greeting her like an old friend. She placed her fingers on the keys, her breath steadying as she closed her eyes. This piano wasn't perfect. Its keys were chipped, its sound a little uneven, but it had held her secrets, her fears, her quiet hopes. Today, it would hold something new. She began to play, a slow, gentle melody rising into the room like morning light spilling across a dark floor. Each note carried pieces of her story, the long nights, the trembling hands, the silent halls, the moment she finally stood up. Monica stood nearby, one hand over her heart, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her smile never wavered. The music filled the room, weaving through every corner, wrapping around them both like a warm blanket. Alyssa's fingers moved with quiet confidence, no longer hesitating, no longer afraid of who might be listening. She was no longer the silent girl in the back of the class, no longer the invisible shadow slipping through marble halls. She was here. She was alive. And her voice, once trapped behind clenched teeth and lowered eyes, now soared with every note. When she reached the final chord, she let it linger, her hands hovering above the keys as though holding the last breath of a long, hard winter. She opened her eyes and looked at her mother, who nodded once, strong and certain. Alyssa let out a slow exhale, her heart full and clear. They never heard her voice. Now the world would never forget it.